Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and the con is on when I put George Roy Hill's The Sting against Steven Soderbergh's Ocean's 11. And this one was a real close one because both of these movies are on, for me, on about the same level. So this round will be a real nitpicky one. So let's just get down to it. First off, we have George Roy Hill's The Sting, which is the second time that he directed Paul Newman and Robert Redford. The first one, of course, being Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And I find this one to be a lot more better than Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I don't know if it's the fact that, the second time around, both the director and stars knew their each other's rhythm and were able to fucking just really just put some work in. But the film centers around Robert Redford, who's trying to pull off a revenge con on this crime lord played by Robert Shaw, who is an exceptional villain. Robert Shaw really was great at playing villains, and I think this was probably his greatest villain. He just chews the scenery, and that poker game with him and Paul Newman is one of the greatest, just most intense sequences in the film. And and of course he gets Paul Newman to help him, who's recommended by his friend that's been killed, and it's all over some shit that he did too. And so of course he, natural guilt and stuff. But what's beautiful about this film is they don't overstate their plot. We know why they're doing what they're doing. They just do it. And it's brilliant. Everybody in the film is brilliant. Charles Durning is the cop, and fucking, of course, Paul Newman, probably one of the most overrated actors of all time. He was more iconic than he was a great actor, but and even Robert Redford to a certain extent was like that, where he might have been more iconic than he was a great actor. But in this film, somehow they're like, George Roy Hill is really getting a performance out of both of them, where they don't necessarily play buddies like they did in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where they could easily phone it in, where they have to have a hint of animosity going in this one, and all planning and scheming to make all this shit believable. They really pull it off in the same way that they pull off the con in the film, and the whole setup and everything is brilliant. Music's a little, quirky and shit, but it's meant to be. It's a film that takes place in the 1930s in Chicago, and like that was a big trope of the 70s too. There were a whole string of crime films that were from the 30s, that Depression era shit that was, what started the gangster picture back in the 30s with Warner Brothers and all that shit. But that's neither here nor there. But the film itself, like I said, is really fun. And the ending, it's just really intense. There's a lot of fucking real danger in the film, because like I said, Robert Shaw in the film is a ruthless motherfucker. They're trying to kill Robert Redford left and right. They're ready to kill like Paul Newman's character at a moment's notice and shit. And then there's like the feds and just like everybody's playing everybody, and it's just so intricate and the kind of like classic Hollywood movie that you just love. And ironically, for like being like one of the biggest hits of 1973, and especially sweeping the Oscars that year, the kind of shit that New Hollywood was trying to break away from, they managed to do it better than the old Hollywood and shit. Especially with the two of the biggest stars of the time just playing in the sandbox, so to speak, and shitting out gold. And so like I said, I'm not the biggest Redford or Newman fan either, but they really crushed in this film. And Eileen Brennan's wonderful in the film as well, and Ray Walston. The film boasts a bevy of like character actors. You get your two big main stars, a great villain, and it's just a recipe for greatness. And then we move on to Ocean's 11, directed by Steven Soderbergh, which is a remake of the Rat Pack film of the same name from the 60s. And this is more of a heist film, but it also involves a lot of con and shit and stuff. And of course, you got the Robert Redford of the 90s, Brad Pitt, in this film, as well as George Clooney, who leads this whole, where he is the Oceans of the title, and gets his 11 people together and pulls off this impossible heist that's gonna rob not just one Las Vegas casino, but three of them motherfuckers. So it's already, they get Elliot Gould's in this. The cast itself might even be better than the movie. Andy Garcia is the casino boss that they're ripping off. And, you've also got Julia Roberts, who's Ocean's ex-wife in the film. And then, Scott Conn, Casey Affleck, the great Bernie Mac. And, just a bevy of other motherfuckers. Don Cheadle is the demolition expert guy. There's just, the film it's fun, and it's a lot like a cartoon. It's like Soderbergh himself playing in the sandbox, trying his best to do the whole Richard Lester thing. It's definitely a throwback to the kind of films that were made in the 60s and 70s, these, all-star heist movies, not very long either. It's a pretty lean, just under 2 hours. They kind of do, there's not a whole lot of fat in the film. It just kind of has, it might even be a little slower paced than The Sting, but that was also Soderbergh's style. He was kind of a slow burn director. He's an art guy too, but he has a way of wrangling these stars like that. He's also got Matt Damon in the film, and everybody kind of plays their part, and hits their mark, do what they need to do, but the film itself is very basic, the kind of shit that you see, played on a loop on TNT, and you can pick it up anywhere, anytime. If you've seen it once, or twice, you kind of know the rhythm of the film and what's going to happen. So there's not really anything new that you find watching it again or anything. And like I said, the reasoning too is so lame. He's doing this, he's robbing these casinos just to get back at the guy who's now banging his ex-wife, and is a way to win her over and shit, and like, give me a fucking break, Nell Carter. I mean, that's where the nitpicking gets down to as well, because with The Sting, it's a way better reason. They killed Robert Redford's, friend and mentor, taught him everything about the con artist game and shit. And, he wants to get he can't really, he doesn't feel like he can kill somebody, but he can sure as hell con the motherfuckers. And he certainly does that with the help of Paul Newman. And there's so many great scenes where it's like, you get the kind of the great chemistry that George Clooney and Brad Pitt have, but it's more of kind of a bromance type thing. And it's, it's real fucking sensitive, where it's like The Sting is very fucking harsh. So clearly this round has to go to The Sting, because, where I said these movies are kind of on the same level, The Sting has a lot more balls than Ocean's 11, which was mostly the case in the 70s, because like, those, balls to the wall, fucking intense, don't give a shit. They still made movies for men. This was like, still, it was getting into the early 2000s where they kind of stopped. They still made movies for men, but they kind of cut the nuts off of them in the way that, like, they're all sensitive and shit. He's doing it all to get his woman back and all this shit. And, it's all like, put emotions into it. We're not supposed to put emotions into it, but we're going to put emotions into it, The Sting was executed cold. They got away with it. They got away with it in Ocean's 11, but you know what? They got away cleaner in The Sting. So like I said, The Sting gets this round. And so if anybody's keeping score, that's 33-30. 70s are now up by 3. They're coming up. They're coming back again. The 90s were getting them for a while. But like I said, man, the 90s and most of their films, the nuts were cut off of them. And, just to kind of appease a mass audience, The Sting, or the 70s in general, just wanted to create great fucking art. They didn't always hit, but sometimes you get stuff like The Sting where you can understand why they swept the fucking Oscars. And so, like I said, if anything I've said is wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. That's what they're there for. And, if you got any suggestions, I'm open to those. I got like 5 pages of this shit. That's why you see these bonus rounds. The next main event, which happens on Saturdays, will be Logan's Run versus Gattaca. You will see a bunch of these other ones because I got to know. I can't wait that long to find out. And I know y'all are hungry for content. So like I said, these will roll as I got the time to do them. And, anybody want to collaborate, anybody want to debate, I need more content myself. So, I'll debate on what's shit and what's not. So, like I said, summer's almost over, but this shit is only heating up.